I watched Ethan Hale stand at the end of the conference table like a man unveiling a miracle. He spoke smoothly about alignment, execution, and vision, sprinkling my work with his language until it sounded like it had always belonged to him. When the board nodded, he smiled, not proud, amused, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. "Results like this don't happen by accident," he said, eyes flicking briefly in my direction. "They happen when leadership knows when to step in." The room chuckled. I didn't. I was the one who built the operational spine of that project. I designed the risk controls, flagged the regulatory gaps, and held the final approval authority that kept the company out of court. I wasn't flashy. I was necessary. Ethan, by contrast, loved summaries, slides, and applause. He presented. I prevented disasters no one ever saw. The meeting ended with handshakes and congratulations. Mine came with a thin smile from HR waiting outside the room. They used the word restructuring, the way companies do when they want to sound strategic instead of cowardly. My role, they said, was no longer needed. The project had matured. Ethan didn't look back as I was escorted out of the narrative he had just claimed. Shock hit first, sharp and disorienting. Then came the pressure, the kind that tightens your jaw because you know exactly what just happened and no one will say it out loud. The wrong person had been rewarded. The right one had been erased, cleanly, efficiently. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I packed what I was allowed to pack and left them with their certainty intact. Ethan would celebrate. The board would move on. Finance would follow the story they had been told. But as I stepped away, one detail surfaced with perfect clarity during the final review. When the numbers were rushed and the risks waved aside, I had paused. I had warned them, and I had not signed. That signature was still missing, sitting quietly where I left it, waiting for someone to notice. Soon enough. Inevitably. Before we go any further, take a breath with me for a second. These last days of the year can feel heavy. Are you slowing down? Spending time with family? Or still pushing through work as usual? Let me know where you're listening from right now. It always means more than you think. And if this story is starting to feel familiar, consider subscribing and staying with me. What happens next is where everything quietly starts to shift. I didn't need applause to know what I'd built. I needed the silence that followed disasters that never happened. That was my work. When a vendor collapsed mid-quarter, I rewrote the exposure model overnight so finance wouldn't panic. When legal flagged a reporting inconsistency, I traced it back to a single assumption and corrected the data before it reached auditors. When regulators shifted guidance without warning, I adjusted controls quietly, keeping the company compliant while everyone else slept. Ethan Hale watched all of it like a spectator at a game he planned to claim afterward. He loved the microphone, the decks, the clean summaries that skipped the mess. In meetings, he'd ask for confidence, not proof. He didn't want the uncomfortable parts, the choices that left fingerprints. Those landed on my desk. I made calls that couldn't be undone, knowing that if anything went wrong, my name would be the one remembered. There was a moment that still burned. A late review, pressure rising, deadlines breathing down our necks. I laid out a risk that could trigger penalties if we rushed. I didn't dramatize it. I showed the math. Ethan smiled and said we were overthinking it. Momentum matters, he told the room. Already moving on, I asked for time. He asked for alignment. The room followed him. After that, I did what I always did. I contained the risk anyway. I tightened controls, added buffers, fixed assumptions no one thanked me for. I kept us safe from the consequences of his impatience. That was the bargain I'd accepted long before Ethan arrived. I would be invisible as long as the company stayed intact. The termination was efficient, no debate, no review of outcomes, just a meeting with HR and a sentence about restructuring that didn't bother to explain itself. My access ended before the conversation did. Ethan never appeared. He didn't need to. The story had already been written without me. What hurt wasn't the job. It was the erasure, months of judgment, discipline, and restraint reduced to a footnote no one read. I left with my professionalism intact and my pride scraped thin, telling myself that restraint still mattered. That night, curiosity pulled me back to my inbox. I searched for the last project thread, the one Ethan had paraded in front of the board. There it was, stamped complete. His note declared the work finalized, approved, and ready to proceed. I read it twice, then a third time. He had marked the project finished without meeting the final conditions, without the controls, without my sign-off. He had crossed the finish line alone and expected the system to applaud. I closed the laptop and sat with the weight of it. The anger didn't explode. It compressed. My self-respect had been trampled, but the truth was still intact. Waiting, he thought he'd finished the project. I knew better. And soon. Others would too. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. I hadn't been fired for failure. I'd been removed for friction. My insistence on standards had slowed a narrative that needed speed more than accuracy. Ethan wanted momentum. I wanted certainty. Those two never coexist for long. I understood then that patience would matter more than protest, and timing would decide everything. Silence would become my sharpest instrument. I kept my voice level when I handed things over. No speeches, no warnings, just folders labeled the way they'd always been. Notes written in the same careful shorthand I used for myself. People mistake calm for acceptance. I let them. I didn't file a complaint, didn't call a lawyer, didn't correct the story circulating through the building. Silence was easier. Silence felt safer. And silence, I knew, had weight. I walked out the way I'd walked in for years. Unremarkable, useful, forgettable by design. That had been my role. I wasn't hired to inspire confidence. I was hired to confirm reality. My authority lived in margins and footnotes. In the final checkpoint, everyone rushed past when momentum felt good. I had been the last person required to say yes. The final sign-off wasn't ceremonial. It existed for one reason: to stop mistakes before they became consequences. Ethan Hale celebrated like consequences were optional. The internal newsletter ran his photo above a headline about decisive leadership. His bonus was mentioned in whispers that weren't subtle. He gave a short speech thanking the team, which meant the room, not the work, watching from a distance. I felt oddly detached, like someone observing a familiar routine performed incorrectly. He spoke as if the project were sealed, finished, complete. He sounded relieved. I didn't correct him. I finished my exit checklist, returned credentials, and left instructions no one planned to read. My calm was practiced. It had to be. Years of crisis management had taught me how to hold still while pressure built elsewhere. I reminded myself that truth didn't need my voice to exist. It needed time. The first morning after I left, my phone stayed quiet. The second was the same. I started to believe they had moved on cleanly, that my absence had been absorbed without friction. That belief lasted until late afternoon, when an unfamiliar subject line appeared in my inbox. Forwarded by habit rather than intent, it was from Margaret Collins, the CFO, direct, unembellished. She asked a single question about final approval documentation for the project Ethan had announced as complete. She requested confirmation of the sign-off and the supporting compliance review. There was no urgency in her tone. There never was. Finance doesn't rush. Finance waits. I watched the thread update over the next hour. Replies came quickly at first, confident but vague. Someone referenced a prior meeting. Another attached a summary deck. No one answered the question. Margaret repeated it, more precisely this time. Who had authorized the final release? Which controls had been certified? Silence followed, thicker than before. I felt something settle in my chest, not satisfaction, not anger, but recognition. This was the quiet I understood. the kind that grows teeth. I hadn't needed to speak because the system was already asking on my behalf. Ethan's celebration depended on a step he'd skipped, a formality he'd dismissed as caution. That step had been mine. I didn't reply. I wasn't obligated to. I closed the email and set the phone down, resisting the urge to fill the gap. Silence. Used properly. Does the work for you? Somewhere across town. Meetings were being scheduled, calendars adjusted, confidence recalibrated. I made coffee and sat with the stillness, aware that something had shifted without my involvement. Ethan had crossed a finish line no one had marked. Margaret was standing at the gate, clipboard in hand, waiting for a signature that didn't exist. The quiet they ignored was no longer empty. It was active, patient, and unmistakably alive. Most listeners miss what just happened here. Did you hear it? Finance doesn't cheer. It listens. I learned that long before my name disappeared from the org chart. And I felt it again when the review began. Quiet requests, neutral questions, no accusations, just a methodical pull on threads that only unravel when something has been tied incorrectly. The finance team started where they always do, reconciling claims with controls. They reviewed what Ethan had declared complete and compared it to what had actually been approved. Numbers lined up until they didn't. The revenue assumptions held until someone asked who had authorized the final release. That was the point where momentum slowed. That was where confidence thinned. Margaret Collins didn't raise her voice. She never does. She asked for documentation. She asked for the final sign-off. She asked for the compliance confirmation that turns intent into permission. The answers arrived dressed as certainty, but empty underneath. Slides, summaries, references to meetings that produced nothing binding. Margaret waited, patient and unmoved. I could feel it from a distance, the way you feel pressure change before a storm. Finance doesn't speculate, it protects. When protection is unclear, it stops. Margaret made the call late in the afternoon, after giving everyone enough rope to answer properly. She froze disbursements tied to the project, not as punishment, as insulation. No funds moved without proof, no exceptions. Ethan reacted exactly as I expected. Loudly. He called it procedural friction. He complained about timing. He said the project was already celebrated, already promised, already sold internally. He argued that a missing signature was a technicality. He spoke like someone accustomed to doors opening because he was impatient. Margaret didn't argue back. She explained the exposure in plain language, without authorization. Releasing funds would place the company at risk. Without verification, any reward tied to completion would be premature. Her job wasn't to preserve narratives. It was to prevent liability, finance, she reminded them. Answers last. Meetings multiplied. Calendars filled. People who had congratulated Ethan days earlier began asking careful questions. What had been approved? When? By whom? The room temperature dropped. Confidence evaporated into process. I stayed out of it. That was important. Interference would turn inevitability into intent. Silence allowed the system to remain neutral, and neutrality was devastating. The more they searched for a shortcut, the more obvious the absence became. The signature they needed wasn't delayed. It didn't exist. By the second day, Margaret escalated. Internal audit was notified, not as an accusation, but as a requirement. When approvals can't be traced, oversight follows. That was the rule. It always had been. Audit activation wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, and once activated, it doesn't ask permission to continue. Ethan tried to frame it as overreaction. He demanded flexibility. He reminded people of deadlines and optics. None of it mattered. Finance had already done the one thing it does best when certainty is missing. It stopped movement. The freeze spread quietly. Payments paused. Bonuses held. Commitments flagged. No announcement, no memo. Just a gradual realization that nothing was moving forward anymore. The company wasn't in crisis. It was in suspension. That was the moment I felt the chill. Not satisfaction, recognition. This was the consequence I'd built safeguards for. The moment when speed collides with accountability. I hadn't caused it. I had simply refused to prevent it. Late that evening, a new message circulated. Internal audit would begin a formal review of the project's approval path and reporting accuracy. The language was careful, neutral, unavoidable. I understood then why this stage felt colder than termination. Being fired was personal. This was structural. Systems don't care who you are, only whether you fit. Ethan had skipped the one gate designed to slow him down. Margaret hadn't targeted him. She had protected the company from him. The distinction mattered. It meant the outcome wouldn't be argued away. It would be documented, reviewed, and repeated until everyone understood what had failed and why. No speeches followed, only procedures unfolding with quiet inevitability. Audit didn't arrive with accusations. It arrived with calendars. Daniel Brooks scheduled interviews in neutral blocks, requested datasets without commentary, and asked for source documents the way surgeons ask for instruments. Precise, unemotional, effective. By the time his team appeared on internal directories, the air inside the company had tightened. Daniel was known for one rule: evidence speaks. Opinions sit down. He didn't care about celebration decks or hallway consensus. He cared about what changed, who changed it, and why. His team began mapping revisions across the project timeline, tracing entries back to hands and timestamps. The patterns surfaced quickly. Numbers hadn't been fabricated. They'd been softened, risks diluted, assumptions stretched. Everything still defensible at a glance. Everything prettier than reality. The revisions clustered around a narrow window, after my refusal to sign. That fact wasn't dramatic. It was chronological. When approvals stalled, adjustments began. Language shifted from conditional to confident. Projections slid forward a quarter. Safeguards were reframed as future work. No single edit screamed misconduct. Together, they hummed with intent. Pressure mounted as Daniel's questions grew sharper. Ethan Hale stopped smiling. He attended meetings he had previously delegated, speaking faster, explaining more, correcting people mid-sentence. He insisted the changes were clarifications, not corrections. He emphasized urgency, momentum, leadership. Daniel listened and wrote nothing. I was asked to provide context, not testimony. Context. Daniel wanted to understand the original controls and why they existed. I explained the risk thresholds, the compliance triggers, the final gate designed to prevent premature claims. I didn't editorialize. I didn't accuse. I described function. Systems don't get offended. They fail or they hold. As interviews continued, the room temperature dropped another degree. People realized audit wasn't debating strategy. It was reconstructing truth. Each version control log told a small story. Each approval chain ended at the same missing point. My sign-off wasn't delayed. It was absent by design. Ethan's voice carried through walls now. He challenged scope. He questioned authority. He framed the audit as obstruction. Daniel responded with dates and file hashes. The louder Ethan became, the quieter the process grew. That imbalance unsettled everyone. Late on the third day, Daniel requested archived communications. The request was standard, almost casual. My name appeared again. This time in email threads labeled warnings, formal notes outlining unresolved risks, clear statements declining approval until conditions were met, time-stamped, acknowledged, ignored. The room didn't react. Daniel nodded once. The smallest movement possible. Evidence doesn't need emphasis. He marked the file and continued. But I felt the shift. The pressure changed direction. This wasn't about a missing signature anymore. It was about documented dissent and subsequent alteration. Ethan tried to get ahead of it. He reached out, offering explanations, proposing remedial steps. He framed my cautions as conservative bias. Daniel asked whether any of my concerns had been addressed before the changes were made. Silence answered. Audit confirmed what chronology already showed. Adjustments followed resistance. Approval language replaced uncertainty. Completion was declared without resolution. None of it required intent to prove impact. Process alone was enough. By evening, word spread that findings would be escalated. Not publicly, internally, methodically. I left my phone untouched, letting the tension do its work. The company wasn't collapsing. It was being measured. Audit isn't an opinion. It doesn't negotiate. It documents and moves forward. When Daniel closed his laptop, the outcome was already written in sequence. Not sentiment. My warnings hadn't stopped the push. They had preserved the record and records. Unlike reputations. Don't panic. Many people listen past this part. But if you stayed, you know it matters. They didn't call me at first. That mattered. Power rarely announces itself when it returns. It tests the room to see who remembers where it belongs. I learned later that the board meeting began with a question so simple it cut through every prepared excuse. Someone asked, calmly, who raised concerns before this was declared complete. The room went quiet in a way I recognized. Not awkward. Careful. Names were reviewed, roles clarified, memories checked against documents. My name surfaced slowly, not as an accusation, but as a fact. Celia Grant. Operations. Final approval authority. The one who declined to sign. It was the first time anyone had said it out loud, since I was removed from the building. Ethan Hale reacted the way people do when control starts slipping, but pride won't let go. He reframed. He blamed legacy procedures. He suggested that the standards I enforced were outdated, overly conservative, inherited from a time when the company moved slower. He said the project had succeeded despite resistance. Not because of it. The board listened. Audit listened more closely. What Ethan couldn't explain was timing. Daniel Brooks laid it out without drama. The objections were logged. The approval was withheld. The language changed anyway. Completion was declared afterward. The sequence didn't need interpretation. It spoke plainly. Resistance came first. Adjustments followed. Celebration arrived last. I wasn't in the room, but I could picture it perfectly. Ethan gesturing, his voice firm but strained. Board members leaning back. Not forward. The subtle shift when confidence stops working and credibility is asked to take over. That was the moment my absence stopped being convenient and started being conspicuous. By the afternoon, my phone rang. Not HR, not legal, audit. The request was precise. Daniel asked if I would be available to provide clarification on the operational controls and the conditions under which I declined final approval. He didn't ask me to return. He didn't ask me to defend myself. He asked for context. That distinction restored something I hadn't realized had been taken. I wasn't being summoned as an employee. I was being consulted as a professional whose judgment now mattered again. I agreed to speak, not immediately. I asked for the scope of the questions and the materials they wanted reviewed. Daniel provided both without hesitation. There was no rush. Audit moves forward, not faster. When we spoke, the tone was neutral, almost clinical. I explained the approval framework, the thresholds, the unresolved risks. I described what had been requested of me and why I declined. I referenced the written warnings already on file. I didn't mention Ethan unless asked. I didn't need to. The record spoke for itself. Daniel thanked me and ended the call. No reassurance, no commentary, just acknowledgement. I sat back and felt a quiet satisfaction settle in. The kind that comes when leverage returns without being demanded. Later that day, I heard that Ethan had pushed back harder. He questioned why someone no longer employed by the company was being consulted. He framed my involvement as unnecessary, even inappropriate. That argument collapsed quickly. Audit doesn't care about titles. It cares about who knows what and when they knew it. The board requested additional clarification, this time in writing. My name appeared in the agenda again, no longer as a footnote, but as a reference point. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was inconveniently relevant. The power wasn't loud. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like gravity reasserting itself. The system had found the missing piece and placed it back where it belonged. Ethan was still speaking, still arguing, still trying to outrun a process that had already passed him. By the end of the day, one thing was clear. I wasn't being pulled back into the story. The story was bending back toward the truth I had left behind. And for the first time since I was fired, I didn't feel erased. I felt positioned. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because independence gives you the luxury of pace. The audit meeting wasn't held in a conference room with nameplates and power plays. It was a plain office, neutral walls, a table cleared of anything that suggested hierarchy. That suited me. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to be accurate. Daniel Brooks greeted me with the same measured nod he gave everyone. No warmth, no tension, just acknowledgement. He reminded me that I was present as an independent source, not a former employee. The distinction mattered. It placed responsibility where it belonged and stripped away any expectation of loyalty. I agreed to the scope and the recording. Calm felt natural. It always had when facts were on my side. We began with process. I explained the approval framework, how operational readiness moved from draft to verified. I described the final gate, the one designed to stop optimism from becoming exposure. I laid out the conditions that had not been met. I didn't dramatize them. I listed them: gaps in verification, unresolved compliance questions, dependencies still outstanding. I stated, plainly, that I had declined to sign because the project did not meet the standard required for release. Then I opened my folder. Emails first. Time-stamped warnings sent weeks before completion was announced. Clear language outlining risk. Requests for remediation. Responses acknowledging receipt. Silence after that. I provided the version logs next, showing where language shifted from conditional to absolute after my refusal. Finally, the approval page itself, untouched, blank where my signature should have been. No one interrupted. Daniel asked clarifying questions, precise and unemotional. I answered each one. The room stayed quiet. But it wasn't empty. It was focused. I could feel the weight of attention, the kind that doesn't flatter but measures. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. What I felt instead was distance. I didn't work for them anymore. I didn't need to protect anyone's ego or soften consequences. My responsibility ended at truth. And truth was remarkably simple. At one point, Daniel paused and addressed the record. He confirmed that authorization could not be inferred, replaced, or retroactively applied. A missing approval was not a technical oversight. It was an absence, he added, carefully, that any attempt to replicate or fabricate such authorization would constitute a serious violation. The words hung there, sterile and sharp. That was the moment I allowed myself a small breath. Ethan Hale's name surfaced briefly in the context of responsibility, then disappeared again into documentation. I didn't mention him unless asked. I didn't need to. The contrast was obvious without commentary. One of us had refused to proceed without certainty. The other had proceeded without permission. When the meeting ended, Daniel thanked me again and reminded me that further questions might follow. There was no request to return, no suggestion of reconciliation, none was needed. I gathered my papers and stood with the quiet confidence of someone who has already stepped beyond the reach of retaliation. Outside, the day moved normally. Cars passed, people hurried. Inside the company, though, the ground had shifted. The audit now carried a clear line from resistance to revision, from omission to risk. That line didn't accuse, it documented. Later, I learned that Daniel had added one more note to the file, a procedural clarification. If the approval had been falsely represented at any stage, the matter would escalate beyond internal review. Accountability wouldn't stop at employment consequences, it would extend further. I didn't smile when I heard that. Pride would have cheapened it. What I felt was steadiness. I had been dismissed, replaced, spoken over, but I had not been erased. I hadn't needed to raise my voice or return to the building to reclaim ground. I had simply told the truth at the right distance. By the time I reached home, my phone buzzed with messages I didn't open. Curiosity could wait. The important part was already finished. I had drawn a clean boundary between what I controlled and what I didn't. I no longer worked for them. And because of that, my words finally carried their full weight. That calm felt earned, not borrowed. Years of restraint had trained me for this distance, where truth could stand without decoration. Whatever followed would unfold through process, not persuasion. I had stepped aside, and in doing so, I had become undeniable again. Silence had finished the work noise never could, and the record would remain. Don't judge too quickly, because here comes the biggest twist. Panic has a sound when it starts. It isn't shouting at first, it's repetition. Ethan Hale began calling the same meetings, asking the same questions, demanding the same reassurances from different people, hoping the answers would change if he applied enough force. From the outside, it looked like leadership, up close. It was fear wearing authority like a borrowed jacket. He leaned on finance hard. He questioned Margaret Collins' judgment, framed the freeze as an overreaction, and pushed for exceptions that didn't exist. He spoke about deadlines and optics, about promises already made. Margaret didn't argue. She repeated the policy and ended the calls. Finance had done its job. Now it would wait, Richard Hale noticed. That alone shifted the air. For the first time, the CEO asked not how quickly this could be resolved, but why it existed at all. He asked who had approved what, and when. He asked whether the controls had been satisfied. Ethan answered with confidence first. Then, with irritation, the answers grew longer and less precise. Money stayed still. That was the problem no one could spin. Payments paused in places Ethan didn't expect. Incentives delayed. Vendor schedules slipped. Partners began asking careful questions in careful language. When cash doesn't move, attention follows. I wasn't in the building, but the ripples reached me anyway. A former colleague mentioned the mood had changed. That certainty had thinned into caution. Ethan was everywhere, trying to outrun a process designed to slow him down. The system didn't chase. It absorbed. Richard called for summaries, not presentations. Summaries. He asked Margaret and Daniel to explain exposure without adjectives. He listened without interrupting. When Ethan tried to redirect, Richard raised a hand and asked for documentation instead. That was new. Pressure escalated when a partner requested confirmation of compliance. It wasn't accusatory, it was procedural. They needed verification before proceeding with their side of the agreement. The request landed like a weight. Verification required a sign-off. There wasn't one. Ethan pushed back, insisting the confirmation was implied. He argued that internal celebration signaled readiness. The partner declined politely. Implied approval didn't meet their standards. They needed confirmation tied to controls. They needed proof. Calls multiplied. Voices tightened. Timelines shrank. Richard watched his son struggle to provide something that should have been simple. Doubt crept in. Not loud, but persistent. The freeze wasn't arbitrary. It was anchored by evening. The concern had spread beyond one project. When partners hesitate, others notice. Confidence is contagious until it isn't. Questions reached departments untouched by the original work. Everyone wanted to know what else might be waiting on missing approvals. Ethan tried to frame the moment as temporary turbulence. He promised swift resolution. He asked for trust. The system responded with silence. Silence doesn't reassure. It exposes. I understood then how this would feel from his side. The rules he'd dismissed were now immovable. The leverage he'd relied on no longer worked. Authority without authorization collapses quickly. The next morning, another partner followed suit. They requested compliance confirmation before releasing funds. Again, none could be produced. The pattern hardened. It wasn't a single delay. It was a structural stop. Richard's questions sharpened. He asked why the final gate existed if it could be bypassed. He asked who had decided it could be ignored. Ethan answered. But his words no longer filled the space. The system had taken over the conversation. That was the moment resistance turned desperate. Ethan wasn't fighting me. He was fighting a record, a timeline, a process that didn't respond to urgency. Panic met procedure and lost. From where I stood, it was cold and unmistakable. The sun had run into the system, and the system hadn't moved. It never does. By the end of the week, no one was celebrating momentum anymore. They were counting exposure, measuring delays, documenting questions they should have asked sooner. Ethan's pressure campaigns faded into background noise. What remained was a stillness he couldn't influence, only endure. The system wasn't punishing him. It was doing exactly what it was built to do when certainty failed: stop, verify, and protect everyone else from the consequences of one person's haste. There would be no shortcuts now. When the board stops listening, the room doesn't explode. It empties. Questions stop chasing answers and start weighing them. I felt that shift without being present. The way you feel a structure settle after a load changes. Ethan Hale kept talking, but the board had moved past persuasion into assessment. Margaret Collins was the first to make it unmistakable. She declined to sign anything new, not revisions, not exceptions, not temporary releases. Her position was simple and final until approvals were verified. Finance would not move. She didn't justify it beyond policy. She didn't soften the edges. Refusal, stated calmly, is a kind of power most people never practice. The board followed her lead. Agendas shortened. Presentations were interrupted by requests for documentation. Ethan tried to reframe delays as growing pains, but no one nodded anymore. When he spoke, directors glanced at their packets instead of his face. Listening had ended. Verification had begun. Audit prepared its report in parallel, quietly consolidating timelines and findings. Drafts circulated among a smaller circle. Language was precise, unemotional, devastating in its restraint, where Ethan had relied on confidence. The report relied on sequence, dates, changes, decisions, absences. The missing sign-off sat at the center like a hole, everything else bent around. I was asked nothing further. That was telling. The record was complete. My role had been to establish the boundary. The system had done the rest. As the report neared finalization, the mood inside the company shifted from urgency to damage control. People stopped asking how to fix it and started asking how far it would reach. Margaret held firm. Every attempt to restart payments met the same response. No authorization, no release. Partners were updated cautiously. Commitments were reclassified. Cash stayed still. Nothing exposes weakness like money that refuses to move. Ethan pushed one last time. He appealed to timing, to relationships, to trust. He reminded the board of targets already announced. The chair listened, then asked a single question about incentives. Were any bonuses tied to the project's declared completion? The answer came back slower than usual. Yes, including Ethan's. The board didn't argue. They didn't accuse. They placed the bonuses on hold pending audit conclusions. It was framed as standard governance, which made it worse. Celebration turned conditional. Certainty evaporated. That was the moment the collapse became visible. Ethan's authority had been propped up by momentum and reward. With both paused, there was nothing left to lean on. He stopped interrupting. He stopped proposing. He started waiting. Audit finalized its report. The findings were distributed. Recommendations followed. Measured and unavoidable. Controls would be reinforced. Approval paths clarified. Accountability assigned. No theatrics. Just consequences aligned with process. From the outside, it might have looked orderly. Inside, it felt like free fall without noise. The board didn't need to raise its voice. It had stopped listening. That silence stripped Ethan of control more effectively than any confrontation could have. I watched from a distance, detached and clear. The outcome wasn't revenge. It was gravity. Systems correct when ignored long enough. The board chose stability over spectacle, policy over persuasion. And when they did, everything Ethan depended on applause. Acceleration. Reward lost its footing at once. The company wasn't broken. It was recalibrating. And the recalibration had a cost. That cost finally had a name in the days that followed. Calendars cleared around him. Decisions moved upward, then sideways. Never back to his desk. Emails that once ended with confidence now ended with requests. The board scheduled a closed session without him. A procedural detail that spoke louder than reprimand. Margaret's team documented holds and exposures with care, building a map of consequences no one could argue with. By the time the final vote approached, Ethan understood the shift too late. Control hadn't been taken from him. It had simply expired. Silence remained, efficient and complete, while the board moved forward without hesitation. Together, silence carries different weight depending on who is quiet. When Richard Hale stopped speaking, people noticed. The CEO had always filled rooms with direction, expectation, confidence. Now he listened, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table as if the grain itself held answers. The meeting stretched longer than scheduled, not because anyone argued, but because no one rushed to fill the space he left open. I wasn't in the room, but I knew exactly when the shift happened. Richard had asked for the audit summary without commentary. He read it once, then again, slower. The sequence was unavoidable. My objections logged, the refusal to sign, the revisions that followed, the declaration of completion that ignored unresolved conditions. There was no single dramatic failure, only a pattern that pointed in one direction. Ethan tried to explain. He spoke about pressure, timing, expectations. He said he'd acted in the company's best interest. He framed my caution as excessive, my standards as rigid. Richard listened without interruption. That alone unsettled Ethan. The usual reassurance never came. When Richard finally looked up, the room tightened. He asked his son a simple question about attribution. Who had built the controls? Who had flagged the risks? Who had the authority to approve final release? Ethan answered. But the answers sounded rehearsed, detached from the record. Richard didn't challenge him. He turned back to the report. I understood then what this silence meant. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. A father seeing the gap between intention and impact, between confidence and competence. The audit hadn't accused Ethan of theft. It had shown appropriation through omission, credit taken because resistance had been removed. Ethan pressed harder, sensing the danger. He insisted results mattered more than process. He reminded the room that the project had moved forward. Richard asked whether it had moved forward safely. The question lingered, unanswered. The weight in the room grew heavier, not hostile, but final. Richard's disappointment didn't need volume. It settled into posture, into the way he leaned back and stopped defending. He wasn't angry. He was assessing. That was worse. The board waited. They didn't interrupt the exchange. They watched Richard closely, measuring not his words, but his restraint. Leadership reveals itself in moments like that. When loyalty collides with obligation, Richard chose obligation. He acknowledged the work that had been done quietly, the safeguards built, The warnings issued. He didn't say my name, but he didn't need to. The audit already had. He acknowledged, too, that momentum had been valued over verification, that choices had been made without proper authority. Ethan's voice faltered. He argued that he'd acted under pressure, that success required decisiveness. Richard responded evenly. Decisiveness without accountability, he said, wasn't leadership, it was risk. The board moved then. Gently but decisively, they proposed a change in project leadership, effective immediately, not as punishment, as correction. Oversight would shift, authority would be redistributed. The motion was procedural, carefully worded, impossible to mistake. Ethan protested. He questioned the timing, the optics. The board listened politely, then voted. The result was unanimous. I felt the weight lift slightly when I heard, not relief, alignment. The system had reached its conclusion without theatrics. Richard hadn't defended his son. He hadn't condemned him either. He had allowed the process to speak. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was judgment rendered without spectacle. Ethan remained in the company, but no longer at the center. The project moved forward under different hands. Authority returned to where verification mattered more than velocity, from where I stood. It felt heavy but right. Truth doesn't rush reconciliation. It waits for acknowledgement. Richard's silence had been the longest and loudest statement of all. Justice doesn't arrive with applause. It settles in quietly, after the shouting has exhausted itself and the record is complete. By the time the audit findings were released, Ethan Hale was already gone from the project. Not fired, not humiliated, simply removed. The way a misaligned part is taken out before it damages the rest of the system. The conclusion was clear and carefully worded. Governance failure, procedural override, misrepresentation of completion status, no dramatic language, no moral commentary, just a sequence of actions and consequences laid out in black and white. The company accepted the findings without protest. They had nothing left to argue. My name appeared in the report exactly where it belonged, not as a victim, not as a hero, as the final approval authority who declined to sign because conditions were unmet. The warnings I had sent were attached. The absence of authorization was confirmed. With that, the narrative that had replaced me collapsed completely. People reached out quietly after that. Former colleagues, legal, even a board liaison. There were acknowledgments, apologies that didn't ask for forgiveness, statements of regret that understood timing mattered. I listened, thanked them, and kept my distance. Vindication feels different when you no longer need it to survive. The board made a formal offer for me to return. They framed it as restoration, as balance, a chance to steady what had been shaken. I didn't doubt the sincerity. I also didn't accept. Returning would have turned justice into a transaction, and I had already been paid in something more valuable. I declined politely and without explanation. My calm surprised them. It surprised me too. The truth was simple. I didn't need my old title to confirm what I already knew. My judgment had held. The system had worked, slowly but correctly. That was enough. Ethan faded from conversation after that. Not erased, but contained. The company moved forward with reinforced controls and clearer boundaries. Projects slowed slightly. Outcomes improved noticeably. No one said his name in meetings anymore. Silence had finished what arguments never could. I felt a lightness I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Release. The weight of being unseen lifted without requiring recognition. Justice hadn't restored what was taken. It had confirmed that it should never have been taken at all. In the weeks that followed, new opportunities appeared, unforced and unsolicited. I chose carefully. Experience teaches you when to move and when to stay still. I had learned that lesson thoroughly. Looking back, I understand now that noise is often the refuge of those without records. I never needed to shout. I needed to wait. The audit did the speaking, the system did the correcting, and when the moment arrived, I stepped away instead of stepping back in. Justice doesn't need witnesses. It needs patience. And patience, once rewarded, leaves behind something rare. Peace. I carried no bitterness forward. That surprised some people who expected anger to fuel the next chapter. What carried me instead was clarity. I knew exactly what I would and would not compromise again. The experience stripped away any illusion that fairness arrives on demand. It arrives when preparation meets timing. I had prepared for years without knowing it. Every quiet correction, every refusal to rush, every note documented without drama had built a foundation that held when pressure came. Walking away was not surrender. It was selection. I chose distance over validation, peace over position, and future leverage over familiar authority. The company corrected itself, as systems often do when left no alternative. My role in that correction was finished. I did not need to stay and watch it settle. I needed to trust that it had, and in that trust, I found something steadier than revenge. I found closure that did not require applause, explanation, or return. It allowed me to move forward without dragging the past behind me anymore, with confidence intact. I didn't rush into anything after the freeze. Silence had done its work, and I let it finish settling. When the first call came from a partner company, it wasn't framed as rescue or rebellion. It was practical. They needed someone who understood controls, risk, and consequence. Someone who didn't confuse speed with leadership. I listened, asked questions, and recognized the respect embedded in their caution. Accepting their offer felt less like starting over and more like continuing forward without interference. The role was clear, the authority defined, the boundaries explicit, no applause, no politics, just responsibility aligned with judgment. For the first time in months, my work wasn't something to be claimed by someone else, from a distance. I watched my former company adjust to the freeze's after effects. Projects slowed, reviews deepened, decisions required proof instead of confidence. The damage wasn't loud, but it was permanent. Missed timelines turned into lost leverage. Partners rewrote terms. Caution replaced bravado. And it stayed. Ethan's name stopped circulating entirely. Not in blame, not in praise. Absence became his reputation. People remembered the delay, the audit, the uncertainty he left behind. Credibility doesn't vanish all at once. It erodes quietly until no one reaches for it anymore. What surprised me most was the calm that followed. Justice didn't restore my job or rewrite the past. It clarified it. I hadn't been difficult. I had been correct. The system eventually agreed. Not because I demanded it, but because I waited. I grew from that waiting. I learned when silence is strength and when distance is dignity. I learned that fairness isn't fast, but it is thorough. And I learned that walking away can sometimes be the cleanest conclusion. On my first day in the new role, I signed exactly what deserved to be signed and declined what didn't. No one questioned it. That trust was earned, not assumed. I didn't celebrate the outcome, but I acknowledged it privately. Experience had taught me that endings don't always arrive as victories. Sometimes they arrive as alignment, quiet and firm. I carried that alignment forward, knowing it would shape how I chose partners, projects, and limits. Long after this story stopped being told, it reminded me that integrity compounds, and patience eventually returns leverage when noise finally runs out entirely. They fired me for not signing. 2 days later, finance froze everything because no one else could. When this story ends, what stays with me isn't the collapse of someone else, but the very real feeling that I didn't betray myself. There are moments in life when you know you're right, yet you're forced into silence, pushed aside, treated like an obstacle. That feeling isn't loud, it's slow, heavy, and it makes you question your own worth. I lived inside that moment, and the hardest part wasn't being fired, it was holding on to my self-respect when no one stood with me. The practical lesson I took from this is simple systems can be manipulated in the short term, but truth takes time, not noise. The emotional value lies here when you're patient enough not to destroy yourself with resentment. You realize justice doesn't arrive like fireworks. It arrives like daylight, slow, clear, and impossible to deny. And the most human lesson of all is this: silence at the right moment isn't weakness, it's maturity. If you're still listening right now, will you stay with me until the end? After finishing this story, take a moment to care for yourself. Drink a glass of water, take a deep breath, or stand up and stretch for a few minutes. Your body needs attention too, just like your mind. Where are you listening from? At home, in the car, or during a late shift at work, if this story touched you in any way? I'd love for you to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Please consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who might need to hear this today, and subscribing to the channel to stay with us for the stories ahead, because sometimes just knowing you're not alone is already a form of justice.